There's a strange thing that happens when people talk about the Victorian slum priest ritualists. People immediately go to ascetics. It seems obvious: the incense, the vestments, the candles, the liturgical drama, even bishops having theological palpitations, and sometimes, yes, even riots, maybe because someone dared use incense without episcopal permission. The Victorian slum priest ritualists are entertaining, they really are. But here's what bothers me, and I'll be honest, it bothers me more the longer I research this stuff. Somewhere in all this retelling, the thing that mattered most to the priests has been pushed to the background, and that's their theology. Not just their ritual, not just their controversy, not just their ascetic, but their belief. A belief that stood at the center of everything they did. If God became human, then human dignity isn't a theory, it's demanded. And we can talk about incense and vestments and Gothic altars, and we will. But if we don't grasp the core belief, we've missed the point. So in this video on ritualism, I want to do two things. I want to make the theology clear whilst showing the humanity behind it. Because theology in a book can be forgotten, but theology lived with noise and doubt and risk and humor and heartbreak. Theology lived stays with us. And to show you that, we're going to look at the life of one priest, Father Robert Dolling. A man who laughed loudly, trusted unwisely on more than one occasion. He annoyed bishops with remarkable consistency, and he loved the poor without embarrassment, without condescension, and without fear. And to understand him, we're going to highlight 4 stories about him. Here's just one sentence of each. We're going to look up a dying woman and a friend's coat. That's a story that shows us that love costs something. The second story is about a stolen letter and a long journey home, which teaches that grace that risks disappointment. And then a watch traded for a bed for the night. And we see in that story a ministry beginning in weakness, not power. And then perhaps my favorite of all, a greasy mug protest, where we'll see justice done creatively, not bureaucratically. But these aren't just stories. They are theology lived in the real world. So let's begin. The first story, and to understand it, we need the setting. This isn't Victorian gentility. This isn't Dickensian nostalgia with Christmas markets and carol singing. This is Landport, Portsmouth, with 6,000 people, just over 1,100 homes. They're overcrowded and damp and loud and hungry. And at one point, 52 pubs and 50 brothels. These are not symbolic numbers. These are real institutions. Here, poverty in Landport wasn't accidental, it was engineered. The cheap labour fed the docks, the cheap housing fed the landlords, and the cheap morality excused the system. So when Dolling walked into a small rented room to see a dying woman, a prostitute, he wouldn't have called her that. He wasn't entirely entering a shocking novelty. He was entering a reality the church had often ignored. But this lady wasn't alone. Another young woman, her friend, sat beside the bed keeping watch. Beside them, a bottle of brandy. And Dolling gently asked where it came from. And the friend said, "I sold my coat." Let that sit for a moment, because in that world, a coat meant warmth and dignity and maybe anonymity and the ability to walk the streets and the ability to earn something, anything. To lose the coat in many ways was to lose survival. She gave up her last barrier against hunger so that someone else, someone already dying, wouldn't die afraid. Later, standing in a polished church in London, full of respectability, Dolling said this: "Is there anyone among us who would do the same?" And then his humor, the kind of line that disarms even when it challenges. He says, "Don't worry, I'm not collecting coats." But beneath that humor, there's a theological punchline. And that's this: that sometimes holiness is found where polite religion refuses to look. And maybe sometimes the poor understand Christ more deeply than we do. And for Dolling, this wasn't just an anecdote. It was a reminder. It was a reminder that love is only love when it costs. It's not sentiment and not pity, but it's sacrifice. And that belief shaped everything that Dolling did. Now the second story, the boy who stole. Dolling didn't run a charity institution. He ran a house, a home perhaps, and he called the heart of it the common table. And around that table often sat MPs and dock workers and former prisoners, recovering alcoholic curates, street girls, school children, and yes, occasionally even bishops. There were 2 rules: no swearing, no gambling. Actually, there was a 3rd rule, and that was that there's no teasing unless authorized by Dolling himself. Everything else, grace could handle, Dolling thought. And in that household came a boy. He was troubled and bright and restless. He was unstable, exactly the kind of young man the Victorian church didn't know what to do with. But Dolling trusted him. Maybe he trusted him too quickly, maybe too generously, maybe deliberately. One day, the boy stole a letter containing money. He vanished and he crossed the Atlantic. And people said, that's it, Dolling was foolish to trust him. Oh, and soft-hearted religion never works. He'll never come back. But Dolling didn't lock the cupboards, he didn't hide the stuff, he didn't harden the rules, he didn't build distance. He waited. Months passed, then one evening the boy walked into the house and he said something astonishing. He said, "I've come for 2 days to tell you my successes and my failures." Dolling didn't correct him, didn't lecture him, didn't demand repayment. He laughed with relief and welcomed the boy back. Later he wrote, "How magnificent are those efforts to do right, even when temptation overwhelms." And then, almost like a lament, has Christian society no better method, says Dolling. This is the heart of his theology, where holiness is not absence of failure, but it's the encouragement to return after failure. Where repentance isn't punishment, it's relationship restored. It's where grace always risks being hurt, or it isn't really grace. And Dolling would rather have been wounded by love than safe behind suspicion. And in today's society, that feels rare, even in the church where we're looking to push blame onto good guys and bad guys. But the truth is, there is a vulnerability in serving Christ. This brings us to story number 3. The third story, where before Dolling entered the slums, before Portsmouth knew his name, he travelled to meet a bishop about the parish. The meeting obviously was polite, as Anglican meetings often are. But politeness isn't the same as kindness. When the meeting ended, the bishop simply walked away. There was no bed offered, no guidance, no thought. So late at night, Dolling walked through the town and found a pawnbroker. And there, under a gas lamp, he handed over one of the few valuable things he owned, his watch. In exchange, he got enough money for a bed for the night. Later, he joked, well, without a watch, at least I cannot be late. He used humor to mask the pain, and self-deprecation covering the humiliation. But this moment mattered, because from then on, Dolling refused to serve the poor from a distance. He shared their vulnerability, both practically and spiritually. Years later, after his ministry became famous, even successful, and definitely disruptive, the church told him to stop. His theology was too Catholic, they said. His community was too ill-disciplined. His compassion was too unconditional. In the end, he resigned. And then thousands came, dock workers and children, teenage thieves, women who earned their living in ways the church preferred not to acknowledge. People who had been invisible became visible, and they cried as he walked away. He arrived in Lamport with no authority and perhaps with no watch, and he left with something rarer. He left people knowing that they had been loved. The last story is my favorite. Dolling worked on the board of guardians overseeing the workhouse, the place where society put the poor when charity, wages, and hope had failed. It was a last resort. One day, he discovered the children being served their afternoon tea in mugs still coated with fat from dinner because nobody had bothered to wash them. He complained. The reply, the children don't mind. We mustn't be too particular, they said. So at the next meeting, thanks to a member of staff, Dolling arranged for every board member to receive tea in those same unwashed, greasy mugs. There was silence and shock and disgust. And then, softly, almost kindly, he asked, so, should we be particular? From that day, the mugs were washed. Because for him, for Father Robert Dolling, justice was not theoretical, and dignity is universal and practical. If something wasn't good enough for the powerful, then it mustn't be good enough for the powerless. This isn't politics. This isn't political games. That's the heart of the Victorian ritualist slum priest theology. So, what do we do with these stories? What do they tell us? They don't tell us about a perfect man. They're not about a flawless priest. They're not about historical curiosity, though they are historical and curious. But they tell us about someone who believed that grace must be lived, that dignity is sacramental, and that the poor are not passive recipients, but they are also our teachers. Dolling made mistakes. He offended people. He pushed boundaries and sometimes broke them. But he loved relentlessly. And maybe the question for those who struggle with this ritualist side and the sacramental side of high church Christianity, maybe the question isn't, was he right? But the deeper and harder question is this. If Dolling walked into our churches today, would he recognize the Christ we claim to follow? Would he see in the way we treat people whose society have forgotten the love of Christ shown to them? Because these stories that I'm telling you and we're talking about in evangelicalism and ritualism and Christian heavy metal, and even in some of the Mormonism things, they aren't just history, but they're an invitation for us all. An invitation, in this case, to make the future church reflect better the glory of Christ. If you've liked this video, please press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and every Thursday you'll get a new video on ritualism. And God bless.